Right, I'm going to try and do a quick and dirty run through on an example here. I'm bringing in point cloud. I do a standard application of the first things. Cloud compared as a shift in the X and Y to keep the number of significant points down for processing. It remembers that shift for later on. So if you want, you can take a copy of this information and reapply it manually, or it does the application when you redo it. Bring it in. And the data comes in. You will see if I zoom in on this and scroll around, it has a lot of trees. That's what we're trying to get rid of. So I highlight this and I go to plugins, CSF filter. I have a habit of always selecting steep slope and slope processing. In this particular instance, I know that 0.5 and 0.3 works reasonably well, although you can experiment with those numbers. And then you hit OK. It takes a little while. At the end of that process, it will have separated things into off-ground and on-ground. So if I turn off the ground points, you'll see that we've got a lot of data here. There was a strange artifact at the margin of the model. Sometimes those happen, but it's done a fairly good job of removing ground points from overlying stuff. So I'm quite happy with that. I'll turn those off and I'll just deal with the ground points. The ground point surface looks excellent. So now I'd like to separate out two different types of surface so that I can give them a different treatment. So I like to lasso. If I go to the ground points and I go to edit, segment, and I start to lasso the ground, I will go around this process and try to be, normally I'd be quite efficient at this in terms of, or accurate about this, but for the purposes of the example, I'm just trying to rush it a little bit. So I will separate out the road for a different kind of treatment. I'm going to use an averaging algorithm on the road to find the mean altitude point, and in the remaining surrounding ground I will choose low point. The reason I want to do that is because as much as I have done a vegetation removal, it will still have grass and things like that on it, and I want to make sure that I'm picking a point that is low for the surrounding ground. So I've right clicked to finish that polygon and I go to segment out and I hit OK, and this gives me a lovely separation of the road and in this instance the concrete. I could lasso out more onto the same layer if I wanted to at this point, but I'll say that's enough and I'll close that. And then from here we have the road, which I think is the top. Yeah, so I'll just rename that so that I can keep on top. So double click and rename, and keep that as ground, rename. So here for the road, well, we'll do the ground first. So if I go to tools, projection, rasterize, if I pick a reasonably tight grid of 0.25 meters, and I want to make sure that I'm leaving the gaps empty, I actually want to select the minimum height for the cell height within that grid, and I update the grid, and that comes up with, yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So what I'll then do now is export that cloud and hit OK. So if I turn off the road, you can see that at the moment we've got the raster being the low point. I can see a bit of a mistake there that I'll probably need to cut out by hand, but that's not a problem. And then I would highlight just the road and I'd give it a slightly different treatment. So tools, projection, rasterize. I actually think that 0.25 meters is quite bad because I'll still pick up some of the noise in the model. So I'll make that 0.5 meters. And instead of the minimum height, I want to make sure that's the average height. Now, when I do this, I like to check something. So we'll just update the grid. If I zoom in on this, I want the spacing of these points to be a bit random, which it does actually look like there. I'll show you what it looks like if I uncheck that and I update the grid and I zoom in on this. Yeah, you can see how I have very perfect grid lines popping up. That means that it's actually replacing the center of that square with a mean elevation point. I do not want that, so I want to resample in the input cloud. Yep, happy with that. The reason I've chosen a half a meter is because I know that I have a little bit more noise. I'm trying to get rid of that noise to give myself a planar surface. Export the cloud and OK. So now I have the two rasters. What I'll do is I'll clone them and I'll merge them, and I'll give them a different name, raster 0.25 ground and 0.5 have road. I'll turn that other stuff off. You can see that essentially we've got now a complete raster, apart from an obvious error over here that I've spotted. And then I would go from here and I would file, save, and I would just save it as, well, if I'm coming back to it in Cloud Compare, I'll save it as a bin. Otherwise, you'd actually export it back as a LAS, or I have found that the guys that are working on 12D like an E57 cloud, but I tend to just export the item as LAS. Yep. Now, I always pick the highest resolution because I'm not worried about disk space and I am concerned about losing data. And that's that. I can then export that LAS to the AutoCAD people and they can produce a better surface. I'm just seeing things here that I would lasso out by hand. I'm not happy with a couple of these things, but otherwise I think that's actually about as long as it takes.